how can I show you how thick it is on the inside? I think I know how. Hello, here we go. Box making number 2. Just clear up a few things, a few questions that came up from box making number 1. Here's the rough turned piece of yew, or pieces of yew as it is now. And although I lightheartedly said that it would be 3.5 years before I finished turned this, of course it's going to be dry long before that. My bag of 3.5-year-old blanks is only 3.5 years old because I've been too lazy to turn any of them yet. Anyway, today's video is showing how to take one of those rough turned blanks, turn it into a box that almost works. Number 3, well, that one will be perfect when we get to that one. For now, it's box number 2. And here it is, a piece of oak, very rough turned as you can see, and a little bit gnarly in places. Down at the bottom there, that's going to be the base. I'm going to have to taper that inwards to get rid of that dent, I suppose, for want of a better word. And I'm not going to texture this one. So I put it on the original spigot. It's not quite round. I'm just truing up the face of the top of the bottom of the box here, and then putting a little dovetail in. And I'm going to hold this in some small O'Donnell dovetail jaws. So that's trued up now, so I can take that out and I can turn my attention to the lid. Now the lid, again, I'm going to mount it on its original spigot. And using that mounting point, I'm going to turn the inside, do a little bit on the outside, and then I will jam it onto the base when I've turned that, and then finish off the outside and the top of the box. So there it is in the chuck. You can see there's a bit of a flat, so I've got to take quite a bit of the outside off. But before that, I'm just truing up that face, and I'm undercutting it slightly so that it'll sit on the base nicely. And then it's a case of cutting out the inside. Here I'm using one of Les Thorne's spindle gouges. I hope Les isn't watching because I've managed to ruin his lovely sharpening profile. I've got to reprofile it. So the inside is turned roughly, and now just turning the outside and coming from off the blank and moving on it. I don't want to come off the end of that blank and leave a splintery edge. You'll notice a little later in the video there is a little bit of feathering on there which just sanded away. But you can see, I think, the beginning of my problem with this blank, which was that I probably didn't leave enough wall thickness to begin with. I didn't take account of the dents on the outside. Right, what I'm doing now is cutting a base for it so that that will slide over the spigot on the lid, and just finishing off and refining the curve in the lid because I want to take some of the weight out of that lid. I like a box to be weighty so that you feel it's solid in your hand, but the lid shouldn't be over heavy. Right, just tidying up the edges there with a box scraper. Both the scrapers I use are Sorby box scrapers. That tip is sharpened to less than 90 degrees, although you can see I've got a little bit of a catch there, so that I can go in along the side, make sure that's parallel, and then angle it round and cut the top. And inside I'm using a curved box scraper. This really does make a difference to the quality of the cut, although if I used a properly freshly sharpened gouge that would have left a nicer finish as well. But the scraping only takes a few minutes. And here I'm just lifting it up from below the center, as you saw there, just to remove the little nub that often is a feature of some end grain turning. Right, that's pretty much the work on the inside of the lid done now. And to get it to a nice finish, it will need to have a bit of sanding. It's easy sanding that part. The harder part is sanding the sides of the lid and keeping those parallel, not removing too much. So that's not really a job for power sanding. I'm using a little bit of sandpaper there and doing that by hand. Cut and polish as the first of the finishing stages. That was sanded to 240 grit, and then the cut and polish goes in. And because the lid is so shallow, I'm not worried about putting my fingers in inside there. And increasing the speed, turning the cloth round each time so I've got a clean piece, and then that just gets that very nice smooth silky finish. So that's the lid done for now. Next stage is to get my O'Donnell jaws on, which I'm lucky enough to have. Obviously, if I didn't have these jaws, I'd have done something different with the base, a different kind of mounting point for it. Get my teeth in. Right, so that's being turned, the bottom being turned so that I can true that up and put a round spigot on the end, not the rather lopsided one that was there after the blank had been drying for a while. And you can see how that's now nice and true in contrast to the rest of the blank spinning out of round there. So it's back to the original chuck and mounting in that freshly cut spigot on the base. So that allows me now to shape the outside, finish the inside, and to put my spigot on. And here I am again with that spindle gouge, just truing up the outside first. You see I've come off the end here. Better to have come on the end as I've done there, and getting a bit of shape in, having to taper the bottom to get rid of that deep gash that was in the wood. But that actually gives it a nice look rather than a straight side. There is so much potential in design features for boxes, and I'm not even going to do any texturing or colouring on this one. That brings in a whole new dimension. So the outside is trued up, just truing up the face there, again with the Lesthorn spindle gouge, and then once that is true, turning the inside. Now obviously I've got to make sure I don't make the aperture too big, that there's no meat left on the outside for the lid to fit on. It's good to keep checking and feeling when you're doing this and get easily carried away and take too much out or make the shape inside wrong. But I really like hollowing out like this little hollowing out. There are of course other tools you can get for hollowing, but in a little box like this spindle gouge is perfectly adequate. Maybe I'll get into some deeper box making and then show some deeper hollowing. Just finishing off the inside, a little bit of work with the scraper. Again, the Sorby round nosed box scraper. When you're using these scrapers, it's important to look at where your tool rest is in relation to the narrower part of the tool's shaft, because just behind that cutting head you can see the blade does get narrower and it can get a little unbalanced if you're not mindful of that. Sanding, power sanding, and this had also gets a coat of cut and polish, but I didn't put my fingers all the way in. I held the cloth on an extension. And now I'm just sizing up the spigot. I've left sizing the spigot on the outside until I've taken the inside out, because that's going to release some tension. So just trying, cutting a little bit, trying for fit, creeping up on it, but inevitably don't get it exactly right, which I don't mind, because I don't want it to be jammed on so tightly it's hard to remove. I have had that happen before. That's got a very nice push fit, but just to be sure, when I put it on for turning, I'm pretty sure I put a bit of tissue in there as well, which I might have edited out, but I did definitely have some tissue in there to hold the lid on for some of this process. So with the lid jammed on, I can now shape that, and because the bottom is curved, I want to reflect that a little bit in the top, so that it's not too harsh a transition from the curve of the bottom to the top. And then I had this ridiculous idea of covering it all with beads and texture, which went hideously wrong. I haven't shown any of that, but you can see how awful it looks. The oak was far too coarse for something as fine as that, so that gets turned off. And if you're listening to all the commentary, you might be wondering, where that's going to end. As you can see there, I've got a bit of a problem going on with the wall of that lid being a little thin. Right, and I'm now turning the top, and yes, that is the remnants of the chucking spigot that it was held in, and I'm reversing it in. I'm experimenting with doing a few dimply kind of lids, so you've got a different curve going on. And now there you go, there you can see the tissue paper. I've had to jam that lid on as the sides have got a bit too thin. So this is not so much a how-to as a how not quite to, but we'll get to that a little bit nearer the end. So sanding, and then I thought just to give it a bit more stability in the shape, I'd put a little foot on the bottom and just flare that out slightly. It gives it something more to stand on and makes it a bit more stable. Sanding, 120, 180, 240, and then a bit of hand sanding in that little dimple. Not that happy with the shape of that, but you'll see how that develops in the next box I make. And the sanding, when that's done, of course, cut and polish, and then I would put some microcrystalline wax and buff it. I like using the cut and polish because it can go on bare wood. It doesn't need to have sanding sealer on first. So I've nearly gone through my first tin of that. I have got Yorkshire grit as well, and I tended not to use that because of needing to put sanding sealer on first. And when I've done that with my platters, my sanding sealer has often interfered a bit with the colour, so I've got used to using cut and polish. Right, the only thing left to do now is to make a jam chuck. So here's a little colouring experiment being used as a jam chuck, as I did in the first video. And I'm just cutting a tenon on there that I can jam the base onto. And that will allow me access to the bottom. Again, I'm wedging it on and I'm securing it with some paper as well for a little extra tightness in the hold. I really don't want it coming off. And the approach to take with this, as you can see, there's quite a sizable spigot there, is to just take very small, short, light cuts. And for this, I'm using a Robert Sorby 3/8 spindle gouge. And cutting in at the beginning into the center, I feel that gives it more support in the jam chuck. But end grain turning works a lot nicer if you cut from the center out when you're hollowing. And as you can see, I've put a hollow base on because that means that it'll sit flat on the table. Cut and polish on the bottom just to blend that in with the rest of the box, and then buffing that up with some kitchen roll, and we're just about there. So pulling it off from the jam chuck, and there you see my problem. I've got a very thin spigot, and I've also got a very thin lid, but it does go on very nicely, as you can see there. It's got a nice fit to it, but it is just too thin. Well, I hope that was interesting. A little curved box. Nice. I love the end grain of oak. Beautiful. Nice fit. Nice size. Easy to get your fingers in. Yeah, but as I said, I did make that outer rim a bit too thin. Probably still a bit thick in the top. I'm quite pleased with the bottom though. I do like a bit of weight in the bottom of the box, but up here this is top heavy, and I mean there's enough meat probably to jam it back on and turn that a bit smaller, but I think I'll prefer the proportions of it like that. But do you want to see how thick it is inside? I do like the dimple, the concave bit on the top, and I think I might do make a feature of that in subsequent boxes. How can I show you how thick it is on the inside? I think I know how. Right. Now then. Maybe there will be some stills after all. But maybe you can see quite even wall thickness. Thickening nicely at the bottom. I like that. I like the weight it gave. But the lid, well, I haven't looked first, but it's definitely too thick at the top. Look at that. Far too thick. I mean, ignore the thinness of the rim. That should be at least 3 times the thickness of it. But even so, that really did need a bit more stock removal. There was still plenty of room for my lovely little concave feature. But unless you're prepared to cut things in half, you'll never really know what the shape is like. I'm going outside to take some stills of my puzzle box, jigsaw box, my stick it back together box. It's almost as much fun as setting fire to stuff. Right, until next time, don't worry about a fat bottom, but a fat head, yeah, no good. Thanks for watching.